there is a moment in history that almost no one talks about. A small girl, no older than 9, sitting alone in a candlelit room in a palace she was no longer allowed to call home, listening to the sound of her mother's name being erased. Not metaphorically, literally. Scribes were removing Catherine of Aragon's initials from the stonework. Servants were instructed not to speak of her. And the child who carried both their names, Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, and Catherine of Aragon, was left to understand that the world she had been promised no longer existed. That is where this story begins. Not with the fires, not with the executions, not with the name that history gave her. It begins with a little girl learning, very early, what it meant to be unwanted. Mary was born on the 18th of February, 1516, at the Palace of Placentia in Greenwich. She came into the world healthy, which surprised almost everyone, because Catherine had endured at least 5 pregnancies before her. Pregnancies that ended in stillbirths, infant deaths, and one son who lived only 52 days. Mary's survival felt, to her parents, like an answer to prayer. Henry was disappointed she was a girl. He wanted a son. He always wanted a son. But in those early years, he showed her off to ambassadors, called her his pearl, and allowed her to be raised with the education and dignity of a future queen. The rooms of her childhood were not modest. Mary grew up moving between palaces: Greenwich, Richmond, Windsor, surrounded by tapestries, silk hangings, and the smell of beeswax candles. She was given a household of her own as a young child, with a governess, ladies-in-waiting, tutors, and musicians. Her education was exceptional. Her mother, Catherine, a learned woman herself, insisted that Mary be taught Latin, French, Spanish, and music. She was playing the lute by the age of 4. By 9, she was corresponding in Latin with scholars. By 11, she was considered one of the most educated children in England. And then her father fell in love with someone else. Anne Boleyn entered Henry's orbit somewhere around 1526, and the years that followed dismantled everything Mary had been raised to expect. Henry wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled. The Pope refused. Henry broke with Rome. And in 1533, he married Anne in secret, declared Mary illegitimate, and stripped her of her title of princess. Just like that, the pearl became a problem. What happened to Mary after that is something that is difficult to hold still and examine, because it is so layered with contradiction. She was a teenager, by now around 17, forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting in the household of Anne Boleyn's infant daughter, Elizabeth. She was not allowed to see her mother. Letters between them were intercepted. When Catherine lay dying at Kimbleton Castle in January 1536, Mary was denied permission to travel to her bedside. She did not say goodbye. She received the news of her mother's death in writing. She was 19 years old. There is a version of this story where Mary's cruelty, decades later, becomes entirely comprehensible in light of this. There is another version where it does not excuse anything at all. Both can be true at the same time. To understand what Mary's daily life looked like during those years of exclusion, it helps to understand what a royal household actually felt like, the texture of it, the physical and social reality. The palaces were cold in winter, not the gentle chill of a drafty window, but deep, bone-settling cold that rose from stone floors and settled into walls that no amount of tapestry could fully absorb. Fires burned in the great rooms, but the corridors between them were bare, and servants moved quickly with their arms tucked in. Mary, unlike the privileged princess she had once been, now slept in smaller rooms with fewer attendants and with far less say in the arrangement of her own day. Her meals, during the years she served in Elizabeth's household, were more carefully monitored than they had been before. She ate with the other ladies at whatever hour was determined by the head of the household. She rose early, attended Mass when she could, though the religious landscape was shifting beneath her feet every few months as Henry's reformations reached further and further into everyday practice. The Latin Mass, the rituals she had grown up with, the saints' days and fasts and feasts that had structured time itself, all of this was being rewritten. Mary refused to sign the Act of Succession, which required her to acknowledge her own illegitimacy and to accept Henry's supremacy over the church. This was not a small act of defiance. People went to the Tower of London for less. Thomas More had just been executed. John Fisher had been executed. Mary knew what refusal could cost, and she refused anyway. Her Spanish ambassador had to intervene repeatedly to prevent her from being charged with treason. For a period, it seemed genuinely possible that Henry might have her killed. Think about that for a moment. A father who might have his own daughter executed, not because she had done anything violent or criminal, but because she would not sign her own humiliation into law. The pressure on Mary during those years was relentless, isolating, and aimed precisely at her sense of self. She was told over and over that she was not who she believed herself to be. She eventually submitted in June of 1536. She signed the documents acknowledging Henry's supremacy and her own illegitimacy. She later claimed, privately, that she had done so only under duress and that she had written to the Pope in secret to beg for absolution. Whether that absolution ever came, nobody can say with certainty. What can be said is that the signing broke something in her, or perhaps clarified something. She had been taught that the correct response to power was obedience. She had also learned that obedience came at an enormous cost, and that even when you gave everything you were asked to give, the world did not necessarily become kind to you in return. She was 20 years old. She had already lived through the dissolution of her parents' marriage, the death of her mother, her own public humiliation, the execution of people she had known, and the total restructuring of the religion she had been raised in. And she was expected to be grateful for whatever crumbs of royal favor drifted her way. Between Mary's submission in 1536 and her accession to the throne in 1553, 17 years, she lived in a kind of suspended state. She was restored to the line of succession after Anne Boleyn's execution, but she remained illegitimate in the eyes of the law. She was moved from house to house, a ward of the crown rather than a princess of the blood, dependent on her father's moods and later on the machinations of others. The houses where she lived during this period were country estates, away from the main centers of power. Places like Beaulieu in Essex, Hunsdon in Hertfordshire, stone buildings with gardens and chapels, surrounded by flat, agricultural land. The light in those places in winter was thin and gray, coming through small windows in the morning and fading early in the afternoon. Mary spent a great deal of time indoors. She read theology, scripture, the writings of Erasmus, whom she had known as a child. She sewed, an occupation that occupied hours of the day for any noble woman. She prayed. She heard Mass in her private chapel, quietly insisting on the Latin rites, even as they became increasingly dangerous to practice. Her health was never good. She suffered from what contemporaries described as persistent headaches and menstrual irregularities that caused her significant pain. She also showed what modern historians have described as symptoms consistent with depression: prolonged low periods, inability to eat, withdrawal from company, weeping that went on for days without any clear triggering event. She was lonely in a way that had no practical solution, because the isolation was structural. It was built into her position. Henry died in January 1547. His son Edward, Mary's half-brother, the son of Jane Seymour, became king at the age of 9. The regents who governed in his name were Protestant reformers, and under Edward's reign, the Reformation accelerated dramatically. The prayer book was reformed. The Mass was outlawed. Images were stripped from churches. The England that Mary had grown up in was being systematically dismantled in front of her eyes. She continued to hear the Latin Mass in her private household. Edward and his council ordered her to stop. She refused. Imperial ambassadors threatened to go to war on her behalf. She was summoned to court, where she appeared before the council in tears and told them that she would rather die than abandon her faith. They backed down. But it was a close thing, and she knew it. When Edward died in July 1553, he was 15, consumed by tuberculosis. There was a brief attempt to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant teenager with a claim to the throne. It failed. Mary rode south from East Anglia with a growing army of supporters, mostly ordinary people, mostly Catholic, who met her on the road and swore allegiance. She entered London in triumph. She was 37 years old. She had waited her entire life for this moment, and here is where it becomes difficult. Because what happened next was not the reign of a secure, grounded woman who had found peace and used power wisely. What happened next was the reign of someone who had spent 3 decades absorbing a particular lesson about the world, that people who did not conform to the correct faith were not simply wrong, but dangerous. That heresy was not an opinion, but a disease. That the kindest, most merciful thing you could do for someone who was going to hell was to force them to reconsider before it was too late. The burnings began in February 1555. Before that, there had been a period, a short window, where Mary's reign looked as if it might be something else entirely. She released prisoners from the Tower. She refused to execute Lady Jane Grey initially, though she eventually signed the warrant when Grey's father's rebellion made the girl too dangerous to keep alive. She worked to restore Catholicism to England through Parliament, through legal and institutional channels. She married Philip of Spain in July 1554, a union that was deeply unpopular in England, but which she believed would anchor her both politically and personally. She was desperately, visibly in love with him. He was 11 years her junior, already experienced in statecraft, and he had about as much emotional investment in the marriage as one might have in a trade agreement. Philip spent minimal time in England. Mary was either pregnant or believed herself to be pregnant twice during their marriage. Neither pregnancy produced a living child. The first, in 1554 and into 1555, lasted many months. Her belly swelled. She stopped menstruating. She was moved to Hampton Court to wait for the birth. Ladies were summoned. The christening was prepared. And then slowly, nothing happened. The pregnancy faded. No child came. Her doctors and ladies-in-waiting gradually stopped speaking of it. Mary was left to understand, without anyone saying it plainly, that there had probably never been a child at all. That what her body had done was a phantom pregnancy, a cruel physical mimicry brought on by longing and irregular hormonal function. She was 40 years old. She had no heir, and her husband was already making arrangements to leave. It was in this context that the burnings intensified. Nearly 300 people were burned at the stake during Mary's reign, between February 1555 and November 1558. The figure most often cited is 284. They were mostly men, but about 56 were women. They came from different backgrounds: clergy, artisans, farmers, weavers, laborers. Some were well-known scholars and bishops. Others were ordinary people who had attended the wrong sermon or refused to attend the right mass. Thomas Cranmer, who had been Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry and Edward, who had written the Book of Common Prayer, who had signed the documents authorizing Mary's own mother's annulment, he was burned in March 1556. The method of execution by fire in 16th century England was not instantaneous. The condemned was tied to a post, surrounded by faggots of wood, and the fire was lit. If the wind was in the right direction, and the wood was dry, and the fire caught quickly, death came in minutes from asphyxiation. If not, and often not, it could last far longer. Witnesses described scenes at Smithfield in London, at Canterbury, at Coventry, at a dozen other towns across England that were understood even at the time as something difficult to justify. The name Bloody Mary was attached to her mostly by Protestant martyrologists in the years after her death, particularly John Foxe, whose Book of Martyrs was published in 1563 and became one of the most widely read books in the English language. Foxe's accounts were vivid, detailed, and deeply partisan. They shaped how Mary was remembered for centuries. They are also, on the historical record, broadly accurate in their descriptions of the executions themselves, even if the framing around them was polemical. Mary believed she was saving souls. She believed, with complete sincerity, that allowing heresy to go unchallenged was a greater cruelty than burning those who practiced it, because the fires of this world lasted minutes, while the fires of hell lasted eternity. This was not a cynical calculation. It was theology as she understood it, passed to her by her mother, reinforced by her Spanish confessor, validated by the Pope in Rome. She was doing, in her mind, what a good Catholic queen was obligated to do. But there is something else to observe here. The burnings made her unpopular even among English Catholics, many of whom were perfectly comfortable with restored Catholicism, but found the scale and speed of the executions difficult to stomach. Philip himself, not a man known for squeamishness, reportedly advised her to slow down, not out of mercy, but because the executions were creating martyrs and hardening Protestant opinion rather than suppressing it. She did not stop. What do you do with a person like that? With someone whose cruelty was wrapped entirely in genuine belief? That is the question that Mary Tudor leaves hanging in the air centuries later. It is easier, in some ways, to condemn someone who kills for pleasure or power. It is harder to know what to do with someone who kills for love of God, love of souls, love of an idea about the right way to live. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558. She was 42 years old. She had been ill for months. The illness was probably a combination of influenza and what may have been uterine or ovarian cancer. The persistent gynecological disorders that had afflicted her since adolescence had never resolved, and by 1558 she was clearly deteriorating. Philip, who had returned to Spain months earlier, sent a representative to her bedside, but did not come himself. She asked that Elizabeth be brought to her. Elizabeth did not come either. She died in the early morning hours at St. James's Palace, surrounded by her ladies. She had heard Mass repeatedly in her final days, taken comfort in the rituals that had anchored her entire life. Her attendants later reported that she had spoken of angels, had seemed peaceful toward the end. Whether that was true, or whether it was the kind of account that people offer about the deaths of queens, is impossible to say. The news of her death reached Elizabeth at Hatfield, where she was told she was now Queen of England. Elizabeth reportedly said, and this may be legend, but it may also be true, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And then England pivoted, almost immediately, away from everything Mary had tried to build. The Latin Mass was gone within a year. The Protestant settlement under Elizabeth moved quickly, and for the most part, remained stable. Mary's burnings became the foundation of a Protestant national identity that would last for centuries. The story of Protestant England against Catholic tyranny, with Mary Tudor as the central villain. Her reputation was fixed before her body was cold. What tends to get lost in that story is everything that came before the fires. The 9-year-old girl watching her mother disappear. The teenager who was told, officially, that she did not exist. The woman who spent 17 years waiting for a life she had been promised and then had taken away. The queen who finally wore the crown she had been born to wear, only to discover that her body would not give her the air she needed, that her husband would not stay, and that the country she was trying to save was pulling steadily in the opposite direction. None of that excuses what she did. The 284 people who burned at Smithfield and Canterbury, and a dozen other towns across England, were real people, with families, with beliefs, with the same capacity for suffering that Mary herself had shown her whole life. Their deaths were real. Her grief and her damage do not cancel out their grief and their damage. But the full picture, the whole shape of her life, is more complicated than the name she was given. It always is, with historical women. They are so often remembered as a single act, a single decision, a single reputation, and everything that shaped them gets quietly put aside. Mary Tudor was the first queen regnant of England. She ruled in her own name, not as a consort. She proved that a woman could hold that position, that the legal and institutional machinery of the kingdom would function under a female monarch. In that sense, she built the ground that Elizabeth walked on. She established the precedent. She demonstrated that a queen could govern, could make decisions, could declare war, could sign warrants, could hold parliament accountable, could be taken seriously as a political actor. The fact that history has chosen to remember only the worst of what she did with that power is, itself, a kind of pattern. Women in history are rarely granted the complexity that men are afforded as a matter of course. And perhaps that is the most lasting thing to take from her story. Not the fires, not the name, but the fact that a woman shaped by loss, by exclusion, by physical suffering and emotional deprivation, and a lifetime of being told she did not count, that woman became queen anyway. She held power, used it badly in some of the most significant ways imaginable, and also built things that lasted. Both are true. History has told only half the story. The women history forgets to complicate are often the ones who understood, better than anyone, exactly how complicated the world could be. If you want to see another moment in women's history reconstructed, another place, another time, another woman whose story has been simplified or misunderstood, leave a comment below. Tell us where and when, and we'll bring it to life.